All right, Kristin, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'm really excited about this conversation. I feel like I'm very fortunate to have some of the conversations and some of the people that I have on the show. And this is one that I've been looking forward to. My production manager, Aaron, has been looking forward to for a long time. He usually helps me put together like quick notes for the show. And this one was quite robust, just like pages of information that I was like reading through and quotes. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Okay, before we dive into the book, before we dive into what we are here to talk about, which I think is going to be wildly fascinating, I have to do my listeners a service because whenever I miss this question, I get DM'd about it. So tell us a story about a defining moment in your life.
Okay. I would say a defining moment would be my senior year in high school. And in that year, I took off and became an exchange student in Germany. I grew up in Northwest Iowa, small town. For a couple of years, my family moved to Tallahassee, Florida. I was in this big public high school coming from a small Christian school. And it was great. And then my family moved back to Iowa and I thought, no, I can't do that. So I applied and was accepted into an international exchange program. So I spent a year in Germany. And that was such a defining year for me. Not only did I learn German, full immersion, attended German high school, but I realized over time I came to see my own culture from a distance, right? And so I came back to the United States and into college with all sorts of questions about things I had always taken for granted about American nationalism. I had a lot to answer for in Germany in terms of why are Americans such flag wavers and that's dangerous. In terms of my understanding of Christianity, all the things that I'd really taken for granted, I came to view with greater curiosity, and I think that really set me up on a path to become a U.S. historian and try to answer some of those questions. I'm still on that path today.
Incredible. Okay, well, thank you for that context. I think that gives a little bit more flavor to what we're going to talk about here today, and maybe what set you on that path. So you wrote this book, which, I mean, the title, I almost want to spend time on how you came up with this title, but the title is Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And I think it speaks for itself, but maybe if you can just give me, the listener, a little bit more context for like what prompted you to dive into this subject, especially in a time where these pieces have been very much front and center.
Yeah, so the roots of this book go back many years, more than 15 years, actually. So I was a new professor at Calvin University. It's a Christian liberal arts college in the Midwest, and I was teaching a course on U.S. history, and I gave a lecture on Teddy Roosevelt, and I did that intentionally to show my students how gender worked in history, all right, how ideas of masculinity, in this case in particular, change over time, how it's linked to economic shifts and to foreign policy and to race and religion and all sorts of things. And it was after that class period that a couple of guys came up to me and said, Professor Du Mez, there's this book you have to read. And that was John Eldridge's book, Wild at Heart. And any evangelical of a certain age knows exactly where this is going. That book went on to sell more than 4 million copies. I took their advice. I got a hold of it and I opened it up. And sure enough, right in the front is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and went on to, which I just lectured about to show them how amazing gender was in history, all the things it could do. And it turns out Eldridge was doing the same thing with this conception of masculinity. It was a very militant, militaristic conception of quote unquote Christian manhood. Every man has a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. God is a warrior God, and man is made in his image. And so right then and there, I knew that this was something I needed to wrestle with, because at the same time, this was back in 2005, 2006, during the Iraq War and the early years. And we had all this survey data coming out showing how white evangelicals were far and away more likely to support the Iraq War, preemptive war in general, to condone the use of torture, right? All of this stuff. And so I asked what historians had asked of Teddy Roosevelt before, what might one have to do with the other? And one of the things I noticed right away in looking at Eldridge's work and other writers on Christian manhood at the time was that they weren't really drawing from the scriptures very much. They were drawing from Hollywood heroes, from Mel Gibson's William Wallace, and in many cases, the actor John Wayne kept popping up as this kind of icon of masculinity. And so that was really interesting to me. And that's where the title of the book came from. Now, that was a long time ago. I ended up setting the project aside for a variety of reasons. One, I wasn't quite sure, like, it felt really, really extreme. Some of the material I was reading at the time, I wasn't sure if this was mainstream, is this fringe? I didn't really know what to do with it. I pulled the research back out in the fall of 2016 when I realized it was far more mainstream than I had ever anticipated. And that's when the book actually kind of came to be, and pulling out some of that old research.
So can you maybe just speak a little bit more about what happened within evangelical culture that took Jesus, who, I mean, Christ is a figure unto itself that we could have hours and hours and hours of conversation about. But I think that it took Christ, who's largely an advocate for peace, love, social coherence, acceptance, and really true acceptance, like unconditional acceptance, not just acceptance of people that you like, but acceptance of people that sort of break the mold of what your social values are, maybe what your religious beliefs are. And I think what's interesting is that the evangelicals have sort of taken this character, and not all, right? I think we should maybe preface that. Not all, but there seems to be a subset of evangelicals that have taken him and turned him into like this gun-toting, warmongering symbol of masculinity that is meant to stand for something that I've just never seen in the Bible. And I think to the degree that I've witnessed a lot of men online, I've even seen men online posting pictures of Jesus with MAGA hats and Jesus with assault rifles, and I'm like, the cognitive dissonance that it creates, I can't seem to grasp it. And so I would love to hear maybe a little bit of the history of that transition, or what started to happen within evangelical culture that allowed for that leap that seems so massive.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the corrupted the faith part of the subtitle. And Jesus and John Wayne is a work of history, but there is this little critical edge as well. So where I'm kind of taking evangelicals at their word, right? Evangelicals self-identify as Bible believing Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And then I am suggesting in the critical framing of this book that there is something going on here, a corruption of precisely what you're spelling out of who Jesus is at the heart of the Gospels, because when I read the Gospels, and when I read about Christ, it just seems like over and over again, Jesus subverts human expectations, right? That expectations for what a Messiah was supposed to be and to do, and this isn't about human power structures. This is about Jesus divests himself of power, and that's the radical nature of the gospel of Christ. And it is then to follow Christ is to follow that self-sacrifice. And so there's that kind of critical edge where what I see happening over history is that this other model of Christian masculinity gets elevated, of what it means to be a man is to be aggressive, to be a fighter. And I trace this back to the Cold War era, where in the 1940s and 1950s, evangelicals really stressed the masculine role of protector and provider in the Cold War context. And because of the Cold War, protector is especially important. And it's not metaphorical, right? You need to actually protect faith, family, and nation against communism, which was anti-God, anti-Christian, and anti-family. And it was a military threat, so we need military protection. Well, fortunately, God had filled men with testosterone to give them this aggression, and that needed to be channeled in this direction. And that's the way that social order was protected. And so you can see that, you can trace this back. You can see this reasoning spelled out quite plainly in evangelical sermons and in teachings on manhood and womanhood, masculinity, femininity, even in evangelical sex manuals. And that's a thing back in the 60s and so on.
I definitely want to get my hands on one of those.
It's a lot.
I didn't even know that existed. You just blew my mind with that. Evangelical sex manual seems like an oxymoron. Yeah, it's a genre.
Right? There's a lot there. And so what you see happening then is the formation of this vision of Christian masculinity that really privileges fighting, that privileges this need for aggression because the threat is so real, right? The communist threat. But then what happens is this threat keeps morphing. So it's communism, it's feminism, it's secular humanism. It's, if you kind of trace this history out, it's, this culture wars, liberalism, it's radical Islam, and you can trace it all the way up to the present. So the threat keeps changing, but the militancy is what holds constant. And one of the things that I came to see in this book is initially I kind of thought this evangelical militancy, right, in politics in particular, is kind of this response to fear, right? They feel pushed into a corner. There's demographic changes. There's threats to religious liberty, right? This is kind of the narrative of understanding the evangelical vote in 2016. But what I came to see historically is that more often than not, the militancy came first. And then you had prominent evangelical leaders. You can see this very specifically played out in situations that they actively stoked fear in the hearts of their followers in order to sustain their own power. And so militancy usually came first. What we see then is in the case of Christ, right, Jesus of the Gospels, Jesus himself gets transformed into the image of this warrior, so that Jesus is described by somebody like Mark Driscoll as, a warrior with tattoos down his leg, riding into battle on horseback, wielding this bloody sword, slaying his enemies. And so that ultimately transforms not just the Jesus of the Gospels, but ultimately Christianity itself.
And like from maybe I'm like missing a part of the connection, but like from a scriptural standpoint, what basis does this get rooted in? Because I think that from what I mean, I grew up Roman Catholic. I read the Bible. I read Old Testament, New Testament, and I'm not necessarily a practicing Christian today by any means, but I just cannot recall or fathom any scripture, Old Testament or New Testament, coming from Jesus being used as a means of turning it into what you're talking about, right? This like warrior Christ, which you talk about in the book. So, is that just a manufacturer? Is that almost like the propaganda machine of the patriot, of the nationalist, infusing itself with the religious doctrine? Like how does that start to interweave?
Well, the favorite a book of the Bible within this genre is the book of Revelation, right? That's where you do have bloody battles, and that's where you can get this imagery and swords. And now, of course, in the book of Revelation, the sword is coming from Jesus' mouth, but that's where you have this kind of apocalyptic imagery. And that's a favorite, again, within this genre. But what you have also is this explicit rejection of other passages. So things like, you can't really be a man by turning the other cheek. No, like explicitly rejecting that command, or, loving your neighbor as yourself. Somebody like Mr. Rogers does not come off well in this literature. Like Mr. Rogers is the guy you want to avoid being like. That's kind of the wussification of American Christianity. You don't want that kind of, neighborly love stuff, because the moment, and again, the moment keeps shifting, but the moment is always so critical, and the threat is always so real that for this time and place, you do not want that kind of softness. This particular moment, whatever moment we find ourselves in, calls for something different, calls for this toughness. And again, it's the book of Revelation that offers the most imagery here. But a lot of the scriptures, particularly in the Gospels, are really set aside. Loving your neighbor, loving your enemies, the fruit of the Spirit. A lot of that is considered kind of feminine. Or just not practical, not for this moment.
Yes, it's so fascinating because the Christ archetype or symbol, or however we want to talk about that, or even just Christ as a man or Christ as the Son of God, was really this almost like androgynous character in the way that he's portrayed, because he does have the balance of the masculine and the feminine, right? And he is meant to portray, and I think that's the case with most spiritual entities that are sort of front and center, right? The Buddha, Christ. Many of these characters are the representation of the dualistic nature that exists within us, right? Whether we want to call it yin and yang or masculine and feminine or whatever the case may be. And it seems to be that there's a case for turning Christ into a hyper masculine figure based on what I'm hearing you say for almost like for the ends or the means of power, of being able to control people, of being able to push a very small condensed version of what masculinity should look like, so that there's not compliance, although compliance seems to be the word that comes to mind. So I'm just throwing some things out there. I would love for you to just comment on that if you can.
No, this absolutely, it's a book about power. It's a book about power, and I think the tension that you're pointing to is, what is the relationship between Christianity and power, and what is the model of Christ here? And this kind of masculine, rugged, militant Jesus suggests that relationship is Christians ought to seize power. They ought to claim power because the ends will justify the means. Again, the threats are so real, and you have God on your side, and so you need to seize the reins of power. And so this vision of militant Christian manhood that emerges during the Cold War era is intimately tied to Christian nationalism, right? Again, this idea that you have to defend faith, family, and nation. And it's a military defense to defend the nation, and therefore to defend the faith and the family as well. And so it's very closely linked up to Christian nationalism and the idea of it's the assertion of power, of military power, of worldly power, of political power that is going to preserve the one true faith. And that is really up to them, to conservative evangelicals, as they perceive themselves to be a kind of faithful remnant within American Christianity, within American culture more generally. So they feel like there is this real burden that they carry. And in order to fulfill what they are called to do, they need to assert power. They need to protect that power. They need to maintain that power. And it is a very worldly power. And that's where you can have, again, the ends will justify the means in the realm of politics, in the realm of foreign policy, right? And so, and you've got a figure like Ollie North, who becomes this hero to conservative evangelicals precisely because he models this, right? The ends will justify the means. He does what needs to be done, and ultimately he has God on his side.
Yeah, that has always seemed to be the quagmire for me, is the sort of ignoring the Christian-based values, right? The Christ-based values, and sacrificing those for the means of upholding some ideology. And that's always seemed to be so counter to me that I haven't really been able to understand it, but I really appreciate what you're saying now because I think it gives some context. I think the challenge is that when I hear what you're saying, there's a part of me that's like, well, isn't it okay to protect our families, to want to protect our families, or to want to protect our communities? And I think that the how do I want to say it? That's fine until it's taken to the extreme of it being the sole function, the like primary North Star of our identity, right? I think Jung would have something to say about it in the sense that when that protector or heroic archetype becomes at the forefront and believes that it's sort of like the omnipotent being, that it needs to then claim power, the hero can very quickly contort itself into the villain, right? It can very quickly find itself on the wrong side, and that its values and its beliefs can very quickly get turned against it in some capacity. Is what I'm saying sort of line up with what you've seen?
Oh, definitely. But you're right. There's nothing wrong with it. Protection is a noble quality. Protecting your family, protecting your nation, all of that's great and necessary, right? But then what we can see happening is very quickly, this idea of kind of a defensive mode slips into an offensive mode through preemptive war. You can see that in terms of foreign policy. You can see that in terms of culture wars, politics. Once you kind of define the enemy as, the threat is out there, and threats are many and again shifting. And if you start to identify everything as a threat, you can very easily justify preemptive attack. Again, whether it's in domestic politics, whether it's in foreign policy. And so then this line becomes very quickly blurred between what is protecting and what is becoming the aggressor. But if you see yourself as righteous, as good, and again, God is on your side, and you are trying to protect God and protect Christianity, protect all that is good, it can justify all kinds of things, including atrocities committed, right, aggressively in defense of your own power, essentially. And that's what we see happening. And then it's all cloaked with this righteousness, because it's cloaked with this idea that we are doing this because we are on God's side of anything. And you can see how that works in the case of Vietnam. You can see how that works in the case of a kind of dirty politics. So much can be justified. And you also have, again, this kind of corruption of the faith, that Christianity itself does become contorted. And it's no coincidence that, as you suggest, these kind of traditional Christian virtues get set aside. So it's no coincidence that they look to somebody like John Wayne, who is not evangelical, right? Not known for his traditional values, or more recently, somebody like Donald Trump, right? Both of these guys are perfect precisely because they were not constrained by traditional Christian virtue. Let's look at the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Like in the Bible, these are not labeled feminine virtues, although essentially that's how they're perceived in conservative evangelical circles oftentimes. And these are not attributes that make for this kind of tough warrior masculinity, not at all, which is why paradoxically, it's the men who have not been shaped by traditional Christian virtue, right? These secular warriors who inspire, and that they're brought in, and they are kind of the epitome of this warrior culture that is what is needed in order to protect the faith. And that's precisely how somebody like Donald Trump sold himself, right? Not as the best Christian in the world, but as the man who was going to protect Christianity. And that's exactly how he was embraced as their ultimate warrior champion.
Yeah. Well said, ultimate warrior champion. Yeah.
Their words, not mine.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. It's what's sort of fascinating to me is I can't remember who said it. I'm sure somebody will be able to message me and let me know who it was, but somebody said something along the lines of, like, more people have been killed and more wars have been fought by religions trying to prove that their gods are more noble and peaceful than the other ones. And it's like, how ironic. But I think in many ways, and this is where I want to start to speak about the role that nationalism and patriotism begins to play in the sort of turning or evolution of evangelical Christianity, is that it seems almost as though that when we start to take the war machine, when we start to take the post-industrial military complex of America and all of its virtues and its values as being seen as the sort of like number one protector of the world, and this sort of like military machine that can go off and fight wars and is protecting other countries and et cetera, that those values infuse with the evangelical nature. And I'm curious if you think that one has played into the other more or less, and maybe it's not about more or less, but maybe speaking to what the role of nationalism and patriotism has been in that sort of evolutionary turn within Christianity, within evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, it's both and right. It becomes impossible to separate the kind of influence of patriotism, militarism on evangelicalism, and then the other way around, right? Historically, you can just see how intertwined these things are. So in the book, I write about not just this kind of militarization of American evangelicalism, but I also look at the evangelizing that takes place within the military. And it is this symbiotic relationship. And somebody like James Dobson is right at the center of this, that his, Dobson's family values evangelicalism is being taught throughout the military. Even today, like the military is actively consuming and amplifying these conservative evangelical voices on things like family values, on things like how to manage your money, the Dave Ramsey plan and all of that. It's really has infiltrated. And at the same time, you see this, these kind of military values are embraced by evangelical pastors and writers. And so the military is seen as this model of virtue and model of authority and, frankly, of using violence to achieve order. And so it's very symbiotic. It goes back and forth. I don't think it's really a chicken and egg situation. That's not how history works. It's just intertwined from decade to decade, generation to generation. And so it becomes very difficult to separate things out. I will say, as you pointed out before, right, this is not all evangelicals and not all white evangelicals. There's always been what one historian, David Swartz, has termed the moral minority, right? There is an evangelical left. There has been for this, half century and more, that has drawn from the Christian scriptures teachings that are, feminist, that are pro-civil rights, that are anti-militarist. And this has been a kind of a vocal and dissenting minority. But it's important to keep that power dynamic in mind, right? This is a minority, and you have the kind of popular evangelicalism. And in that kind of popular culture, this Christian nationalism, patriotism intertwined with their faith is just the air they breathe. It's really hard for them to perceive this, even as its own thing. I'll hear a lot of conservative evangelicals saying, I don't even know what Christian nationalism is. It's not a thing, right? Because it's just Christianity to them. Christian nationalism so pervades their understanding of the faith, it's just taken for granted.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, thank you for that distinction. What has, again, there's so many pieces to this conversation that I want to dig into, but I think one of the interesting things for me that I would like to go back and touch on before we start to talk about the impact on the nation and the role that it's played within the division within America is just the conversation about masculinity and the role that it plays within the evangelical culture, within this specific evangelical culture. From your perspective, because I think you talk about in the book how like initiation rites are used, like the church and the church fathers sort of co-opt medieval knighthood initiation rituals involving symbols of the warrior and the Bible and shotguns and stuff like that. And so, can you speak a little bit more to that and maybe like the function that serves? Because I think for me, well, I'll let you go. I'll just let you go.
Yeah. Oh, so much to say there. So you have to kind of understand how evangelicals operate in terms of, if you attend an evangelical church, which could be a church in the Southern Baptist Convention, a non-denominational church, it could even be a mainline church that's been really deeply influenced by evangelical culture, which is a lot of the American mainline, by the way. You're likely to be invited to attend a Bible study, a small group Bible study, as they call them. And those Bible studies are often gender specific. So a women's Bible study or a men's group is what you're going to be invited to attend. And so a very gender segregated. And evangelicalism, conservative evangelicalism certainly is it's very important to distinguish the genders. And there's a way to be a Christian man and there's a way to be a Christian woman. And often these are kind of presented as opposites. So Christian biblical femininity, biblical masculinity, and so on. So you're in this sex segregated space, and then you need something to do. So these are book studies usually, right? Or you bring in a speaker, or you read these books. And so there's this massive Christian publishing industry that people outside this world are completely oblivious to. Like, I went outside of Christian publishing to write this book. I went with a secular publisher, and I had some conversations with my editor where early on he was raising some questions. He wasn't believing the print runs that I was citing. He's like, no, this can't be. And then we verified, like, no, it really is, right? This is just invisible to people outside of this world. But we're talking millions of copies of these books sold. And then they aren't just sold and read, but they're read as the word of God. They're read in these religious settings. And then so you have men's groups, and then you've got retreats, and you've got, well, what do we do to disciple the men in our church or disciple the women? And so we have these weekend retreats. Well, what do we do? Well, somebody like John Eldridge has the answer. Like, you can do Wild at Heart retreats. And again, this is what you do in community with other men from your church, and women are off doing their women things. And this is bought or packaged and sold as, this is God's word for you. This is how you are an obedient man, an obedient Christian. And this is how, initiation rites. So then fathers are told to bring their sons along and are taught how to model this for their sons. And they have to model something very different towards their daughters. So they might take them to a purity ball, or, have to be a different kind of model. But to their sons, they bring them up into this culture. Again, this is simply how you be a good Christian. This is how it's presented. And so, yes, then there's some rights of, this idea of raising a modern day knight is the title of one book. And this was promoted by Dobson's Focus on the Family. The idea that what was lost in modern times was this, not just rites of passage, but this model of chivalry, again, protector, this noble protector who can rescue the damsel in distress. And so boys need to be brought up to know how to use guns. So they should have toy guns when they're little, and then trained to use real firearms as they get bigger, first BB guns, then actual guns. You might, have a steak dinner initiation. You might give them a plaque or a sword, or very much kind of using the symbols to bring them into this idea of masculinity and strength and toughness. And that is how being a good Christian is defined in those circles. So it's really quite elaborate, and it's supported by this massive Christian publishing industry, by this massive consumer culture. And so that's something I try to always point out too. There is a lot of money changing hands here at every step of the game. And we have to see this as a culture of consumption as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've always found fascinating in what you're sort of pointing to is that, there's a few different pieces in there I think are relevant. The first one is that the extremists, the fundamentalists, whether it's, fundamentalist in Islamic or Christianity or whatever it is, it's like when God, your God is the God, and it's on your side, you can never be wrong. And so engaging in any kind of discourse with the people in this field that believe these beliefs, that read these books, that maintain this version of masculinity, there almost is no conversation. There's almost no discourse, because everything outside of that indoctrination is a threat to their version of God, to their version of what it means to be a man, to their version of how a society should be structured and ordered. And I think it's interesting because my wife and I were watching Handmaid's Tale, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I feel, first off, good on the Canadian author, but secondly, it really feels like some sort of twisted extension of evangelical Christianity gone wrong, kind of like gone off the fucking rails and been able to do whatever it wants to do.
I have to confess, I know this is dereliction of duty. I have not been able to bring myself to watch that. I mean, I read the book years ago, right?
Yeah.
Given my research, every time I think I really need to, I can't, not tonight, can't do it. And But here's the question. What is the relationship between the extreme and then the mainstream? And I alluded to that earlier, and I do want to come back to that because that was really the problem of my research, right? As I wrote this book, I kept having that question because there are some really extreme figures in this book. And yet, by extreme, I mean their views, very extreme. But some of these, like Mark Driscoll, right? Pretty mainstream. But then there are also just extreme and somewhat fringe characters in this book. So somebody like Doug Wilson, who, if you're not in Christian circles, you've never heard of him. If you are in Christian circles, you might know him a little too well. So he lives out in Moscow, Idaho. Absolutely would never. He would be offended if you said he was mainstream evangelical, right? He prides himself on being this kind of fringe character. But what I tried to do in the book then is take characters like Doug Wilson, who is blatantly racist, misogynistic, right? And then see how they enter into these networks and alliances with mainstream respectable evangelicals, how they're platformed by places like Christianity Today, how, more respectable figures like John Piper, very much mainstream conservative evangelical, how these alliances are kind of formed and maintained, and how some of these more respectable voices give cover to some of the more extreme voices. And that's really one of the things that I tried to do in this book. They're not one and the same. They're very different, but they come together in these networks and alliances and really form evangelicalism today.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think in the book you talk about like Christian camps where they're talking about war and not only these initiation rites, but talking about how God is pro-war, and again, I struggle to really find clear evidence of that when I read the Bible, and I think what's fascinating for me, being in the I don't know how else to sort of talk about it, but within the sort of healing modality space, right? Really focused in on wellness of any kind and social coherence, right? Wellness as a byproduct of social coherence, that if you are well, you should be able to find some level of coherence within your community, within your society, regardless of disagreements in beliefs, so long as the other person's beliefs aren't extremely dangerous or damaging to you in a way that they're wanting to wish harm upon you. But I think one of the challenges that I find in a lot of this narrative and this viewpoint of masculinity from an evangelical perspective, or from Christ, warrior Christ perspective, is that it almost tries to extract and cut out any feminine qualities from a man. And I think that's the interesting part, because there's sort of this adherence to and combination of men and power, that men in this standpoint become synonymous with power, or a very specific version of power, and it's almost like a right that they're given. So can you just speak to that, and then let's transition into the impact on the nation, because that's some juicy stuff there.
Yeah, definitely. So this idea of, it is a narrow path of masculinity that's set forward, and not a kind of holistic understanding. And I had a lot of poignant conversations with men as I was researching this book, and even more after the book published last summer. I get several letters a day still today from readers. Saying how, particularly as men, this model was incredibly difficult to live up to for many men. It's a rare man who can kind of waltz into this really militant, macho ideal and be comfortable in that space. The vast majority of men struggled to live up to this, not surprisingly, right? And they weren't wired this way. They aren't wired this way. And to hear their stories, and I quote a few of these men in the conclusion to the book, poignant stories of how they felt like second-class Christians and not real men, because they couldn't live up to this macho ideal. That's not how they were made. That's not who they were. But feeling that they really didn't have a place in their churches if they couldn't live up to this. And so some ended up walking away from their churches or walking away from the faith itself. Others ended up, kind of accepting their role as beta males, understanding that they weren't the alpha male leaders that were really held up as this is who ought to be leading the church. This is who ought to be leading the nation, right? So they end up kind of giving their loyalty to the alpha male in the room. And so you can see the different dynamics. For some, it's like, this is not working for me. I'm leaving it behind. For others, they end up participating in it and actually kind of reinforcing these power structures by giving their loyalty to the men who most kind of live into this machismo or really just the militancy. And so you see those dynamics. And but you're right that this kind of wholeness is not what they're after. And this ideal of masculinity rests upon, you need an enemy, right? If every man has a battle to fight, and that is essential to being a Christian man, then you need enemies, right? You need those enemies, because otherwise, where's your battle going to come from? And so it depends on it. And you have to keep perpetuating, you have to keep finding enemies, because otherwise you can't prove your manhood. And that's what it is to be a Christian man. That's what it is to be a Christian if you're a man.
Yeah. So, I mean, thank you for that. That's very well said. And I think one of the interesting things is that I think from a psychological perspective, again, I'll refer to Jung. He's just one of my faves. But I think many psychologists would say, but specifically Jung talked about the inner civil war that we have. And what I see happening within the evangelical space is that inner civil war is eradicated and externalized, that it's sort of projected out onto the world, and that all of a sudden this moving target, right, of, today it's transgender people, or whatever the case may be, right? There's a whole bunch of Mexicans coming over the border, et cetera, et cetera. There's always a new sort of target for the evangelical to externalize. Again, not all of them, right, but certain sort of fundamentalists, extremists, to externalize that threat. And I think what's interesting is that it almost is from a place of needing to reaffirm or shore up the sense of masculinity, and the idea that you are more of a man by adhering to the doctrine, adhering to the discipline, right? That there's a direct correlate between your capacity as a man to adhere to the strict rigors of what's laid out within the doctrine, and you are less than a man if you are not willing or not wanting or not capable to sort of follow that rigid ideology. Okay. Tell me about the impact on the nation, because I think that has been something that we've certainly witnessed over the past however many years, and so I'm just going to hand over the torch to you and let you take that where you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've already hinted at this, and this is the second part of the subtitle. So, corrupted a faith and fractured a nation, and it really does come down to this this us versus them mentality, right? That if every man has a battle to fight, you need enemies. It's required, and you've got to continually manufacture enemies to maintain this militancy. And so, what we see is the effects of this over decades. Not trusting outsiders. I mean, somebody like Mark Driscoll was very explicit about, first of all, he really liked to have this security apparatus, right, in his church to visibly project the sense of ever-present threat, like a threat of violence, of physical violence. So he had his security team on his side, flanking him. Men volunteering for security detail, would warn them, you don't go to that church down the road, right? Even fellow Christians, right? That's you're likely to get a false gospel there, and you'll be damned for all eternity. So the threat is very real.
I can't imagine Christ walking around with a fucking SWAT team. Like exactly. I'm like, where, exactly. Like what? Like, it's just, anyway, I know it's one of the things that I like very much have a passionate expression against. But sorry, carry on.
No, and yet, right, this is more common than you realize even today. A lot of churches now, there's consulting firms for security, there are security cameras, there are churches that have, armed guards. This is a thing. This is very much a thing, and it all fits together here. And so what you also have is this long-standing perception of the other, or of outsiders as, again, against us. If you are not with us, you are against us. And so what I found looking back is, decades ago already, you have conservative evangelical leaders warning Christians about the secular media. Like, do not read Time and Newsweek. Somebody like Tim LaHaye long ago was warning Christians, oh, we need a fourth news network, he said, right? We need a Christian news network. And then Fox News kind of fills the bill. We need our own radio, right? We need Christian radio, Christian news, Christian. And that's interesting because it not only kind of reinforces the narrative, right? Shapes the narrative for conservative evangelicals. But again, always follow the money. There is also a ton of money being made within this conservative evangelical subculture, within these media empires. And so it is in their financial interest, as well as this kind of, their ideological purposes for telling Christians not to trust the media. Don't trust secular news, the lamestream media. They're going to be lying to you. There's this idea of, to get kind of technical, kind of presuppositionalism, the idea that all truth is God's truth. And so those of us who know God have access to truth. Mm-hmm. Those who don't know God can't possibly have access to truth, like really about anything. So why would you want to go over into those spaces and hear what they have to say about social issues, about politics, about anything really, certainly about gender, right? We have God's truth here. So that's why we stay within the fold. And that's why we need to consume products that are produced by fellow Christians who share this worldview, as they call it, right? So there's a long history to this of perceiving those outside the fold, and that fold can be defined sometimes really quite narrowly, who as untrustworthy, as ungodly, as actually working against our interests, working against God's interests, working to undermine the foundations of Christian America as we understand it. So why would you want to not just go to those folks, but why would you want to empower them in any way? Why would you even want to allow them to vote, frankly, to shape our nation, because we know that they are against us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I hear maybe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but almost like what you're pointing towards is this subtle and not so subtle in certain instances dehumanization of people that are outside, like really substantial dehumanization of people that are outside of that belief system. And I think what's interesting is what we've seen over the last however many years, that social media has made it abundantly accessible and much easier to allow sort of extreme belief sets and extreme organizations to not only find a new level of communication, but a new capacity to sort of indoctrinate people and bring them into the fold and spread their sort of memetics, to spread their ideologies through. And I think that evangelicals have done a really, good in quotation marks, they've done a really good job of that because it's just very simple, right? If you look at when I look at the memes and some of the content that is being put forward, it's just so simple. And so the average person that is living in a time of great chaos, great disorder, mass confusion, where it's very hard to sort of make meaning within our culture and our society, it's something to grasp onto, and it's something concrete. And I think that's the interesting part about this, is that it is very concrete, and there's something that is structurally quite solid within the way that they operate. Mm-hmm. So maybe my next question that maybe we'll just wrap up here, because I know that we're running out of time, although I feel like you might have to come back on so we can continue down this pathway. talk to me a little bit about the impact that dehumanization has had within American culture.
Hmm. Yeah, you can see that that conservative evangelicals have tended to put up a lot of boundaries, a lot of walls, right? Boundaries around orthodoxy, boundaries around who is a real Christian, a real American. Racial boundaries, right, are part of this. LGBTQ identity issues also. And so I think that this boundary making, both in terms of orthodoxy, but then in terms of their understanding of the good. I can't say common good because it's not a common good. It's a understanding that the good of the nation is linked to the good of their understanding of Christian America, right? And so things like religious liberty are interpreted through that lens. Our freedom to pursue our faith, which is at the center of American identity because of Christian nationalism, right? And so it is this kind of exclusive perception. That said, if the other, however we define it, in terms of race, sexuality, right, converts into our spaces, into our ideology, then they are welcome. And that's where things get kind of tricky, right? Because in terms of race, many conservative evangelicals do not in any way perceive themselves to be racist, because they would welcome somebody who is not white who walks into their church doors, right, and wants to join them in that space on their terms, right? Because that is salvation, and that is, you're now one of us. But on the outside, to work on other people's terms, understand other people's understanding of flourishing, of justice, right? That's where the tension lies. And so I think that sometimes conversations can be very fraught with white evangelicals, with conservative evangelicals who genuinely think what they are doing is for the common good, and do not understand how it is, in fact, in many cases, utterly dehumanizing. How their own narratives tell them that they are the persecuted Americans, and they truly, survey data bears this out. They think that they are more persecuted in the United States, that conservative white evangelicals are more persecuted than Muslim Americans, right? This is their understanding, that they again have the stories that they have told themselves, that we are the faithful remnant and that everybody's out to get us, and we are doing what we can to preserve this nation and to preserve God's truth. That is their world. And so it's really hard to see how they are actually being perceived by many others, which is that they are harming, that they are excluding, that they are dehumanizing, which only adds to this this persecution narrative, right? That they are out to get us. And so it really is a fraught conversation right now within evangelicalism and between evangelicals and other Americans. But it is one of the things that I was not prepared for when I started this research was just how authoritarian some of these tendencies were within evangelicalism. The emphasis on authority, and on who has a right to that authority, what that looks like, and who does not have a right to that. Frankly, I was quite shocked by what I was uncovering, going way back to the 1970s and tracing that up to the present. And so some of our contemporary debates around, voting rights, around protecting the Constitution, the events of January 6th, all of that makes sense in terms of this longer history.
That sounds like a good place to put a pin in today's conversation, but also a potential sequel to our conversation, to sort of track some of that, because I feel like that is a very relevant conversation. Kristin, thank you so much for joining me. This was a wonderful conversation. And where can people go to find out more about you, your work, and maybe check out this book?
Sure. So my website is KristinDuMez.com. Du Mez is Dumez. So it's a tricky one. I'm on social media, have an author page on Facebook at KK Du Mez, KKDUMEZ, but I'm mostly out on Twitter. So every day, every hour, you can find me on Twitter. And the book, Jesus and John Wayne, is available pretty much every place, especially when the paperback releases very soon. It should not be hard to find.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. We'll have all the links for that in the show notes. For everyone that's out there, don't forget to share this episode with somebody that you know will find this conversation wildly fascinating. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is Connor Beaton signing off.